Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Valere Mantels. I am heading the Vienna office for the Office for Disarmament Affairs. There's too many offices around here. And I am very happy to welcome you to this seminar, Voices or Stories from Hiroshima. I think it's very timely that we do this. A lot of activities regarding nuclear weapons in August, September. And of course, very importantly, the TPNW came into force this year, and we're looking forward to the first meeting of states parties. For the moment, scheduled in March, but as I said this morning, it has been a moving target because there's also necessary deconfliction with the NPT review conference, which was bound to be held in 2020, has been postponed, and we'll be looking at it. So anyway, I'm very happy to welcome our distinguished members of the panel. First of all, we have Ambassador Alexander Kmentt. Alexander is a career diplomat. He is the director of Disarmament, Arms Control, Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. But most importantly, in the context of this seminar, he is also the President-designate for the first meeting of states parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Alexander was also responsible for the organization of the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons in 2014, for which he developed the Austrian Pledge, later renamed the Humanitarian Pledge, and which subsequently received the formal support of 135 states, and which was an important catalyst for the TPNW. In addition, we'll have Miss Beatrice Fihn and Dr. Martin Sen. But first of all, I would like to give the floor to Alexander, who will provide us some insights on the humanitarian roots and purposes of the treaty and the deconfliction with the non-proliferation treaty, if I may. Alexander, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valere, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this discussion. The TPNW, as you said, entered into force in January of this year. And this is a milestone in multilateral diplomacy, and it's also a paradigm shift in the decade-long efforts to address the nuclear weapons issue. So already the first resolution of the UN General Assembly in 1946 advocated the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, and obviously we're still at work there. So now with the TPNW, for the first time, the ban treaty sets an international legal obligation prohibiting these weapons, and one that is explicitly based on the catastrophic humanitarian effects of nuclear weapons and the great risks that the collective practice of nuclear deterrence entails. It's based on an increased international focus on the humanitarian dimension and the risks of nuclear weapons. In a way, the past decades, maybe a little bit longer, for example, at the Vienna conference that you mentioned. And this focus has shown that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is, in fact, or the impacts are, in fact, much more serious, much more complex and long-lasting than was previously assumed. So such humanitarian consequences are unacceptable if only one nuclear weapon is exploded, but they are unimaginable if a nuclear conflict occurs. At the same time, the risks in connection with the possession of these weapons and the misguided belief in the safety and stability of nuclear deterrence are also much more considerable than the public is largely aware of. And these are risks not only those of nuclear escalation and nuclear conflict, but also risks of miscalculation or accidents caused by technical or human errors. And new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, or cyber vulnerabilities of nuclear systems they add further very disconcerting layers of risks to this issue. And only last January, and probably you talked about this in the morning, the expert of the doomsday clock, which is well known and it actually goes back to Albert Einstein, they warned that the existential risk posed by nuclear weapons is greater today than it was during the Cold War, because we have more nuclear actors, we have more trouble spots with tensions and nuclear escalation potential. And of course, we have very significant, if not to say massive, nuclear modernization programs in all nuclear armed states. So experts of the doomsday clock have set the clock to a worrying 100 seconds before midnight, which is closer than it's ever been. So the ban treaty follows the logic that there are no right hands for the wrong weapons, as was so aptly put by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2013. And the treaty is, therefore, it's a normative supplement, and it's a further development of, and it's a complement to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which of course also includes an obligation to nuclear disarmament. But more than 25 years after the end of the Cold War, and more than 50 years since the treaty, the NPT, was adopted, this central provision of the NPT has not been fulfilled by the nuclear weapon states, who seem to be unwilling or unable to take steps, directional steps away from the precarious belief that nuclear deterrence can be a sustainable foundation for stability and security. And this is, of course, very much to the detriment of the security of all. Now, the TPNW establishes a clear prohibition norm that is directed against these weapons of mass destruction per se. And in this way, the treaty underscores that the overwhelming majority of the international community no longer sees the nuclear weapons status quo and the permanence of nuclear weapons and the nuclear sword of Damocles over the heads of all humanity as legitimate. And in addition, of course, a clear prohibition norm forms the legal basis from which actual disarmament steps can be taken. And in the case of other weapons, other indiscriminate weapons, such as chemical weapons or biological weapons or landmines or cluster munitions, it was also a ban under international law that was established first as the basis from which subsequent elimination of these weapons can take place. So now, of course, nuclear weapons have traditionally been very contested in the international community, and we have the divide between those who think that nuclear weapons are sustainable means to ensure stability and even a guarantee for peace and security, and those who think that nuclear weapons think that they threaten the security of all humanity and that they are morally repugnant and must therefore be eliminated. And the TPNW has not created this contestation. It simply provided some clarity, I think, because it asks the clear question where one stands on this issue. And this question is based on a compelling and strong set of arguments related to empirically demonstrable facts on humanitarian consequences and risks. So there is very little space for obfuscation there. Regrettably, but maybe not really unexpectedly, the proponents of nuclear deterrence do not like the NPT. They do not like to be confronted with humanitarian and risk arguments. And they do not they do not like that because they do not really have very convincing answers. And they also do not like the transformational potential of the TPNW in terms of its potential impact on the legitimacy and on the legality of the practice of nuclear deterrence and the nuclear weapons status quo. And there has in fact been very little engagement by nuclear armed states on the actual arguments of the humanitarian consequences and risks. Instead, what we've seen are criticisms and alleged shortcomings of the TPNW. And one of those claims is an alleged incompatibility between the TPNW and the NPT, which is of course totally unjustified. The TPNW is not only intended to give more urgency and more credibility to the nuclear disarmament pillar of the NPT, It also strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons, with its focus on the unacceptability of the humanitarian impact and of the risks of nuclear weapons. So the TPNW is also a key non-proliferation measure and in line with and supportive of the NPT non-proliferation pillar. So we have the two key pillars of the NPT, disarmament and non-proliferation, very clearly supported by the TPNW. In my opinion, this is really part of a politically motivated deflection strategy to actually avoid the actual engagement with the serious security concerns expressed by the vast majority of states around nuclear weapons, which motivates the TPNW, and to deflect from the humanitarian and risk rationale that underpins the TPNW. But I think it's also a short-sighted tactic because, of course, the nuclear weapons issue can only be addressed by the international community together, and refusal to engage with the clearly articulated concerns of the majority of states and the compelling and perfectly legitimate questions regarding the humanitarian consequences and risks is not a very meaningful approach. So I very much hope that opponents of the TPNW will adopt a more engaging approach in the future. Of course, the entry of the TPNW is only a first step, and the task is now to strengthen this young treaty and its normative power. Its membership is growing, and of course it's important to grow that. And each additional treaty accession is an opportunity to demonstrate that the international delegitimization of nuclear weapons is getting bigger and clearer. And as I said before, the arguments about humanitarian effects of nuclear weapons and their risks are compelling and raise profound questions about the legality, legitimacy, and sustainability of an approach to international security based on the threat of weapons of mass destruction. And with a progressive strengthening of the treaty and the greater commitment of civil society, I believe that this line of argument will change discourse on nuclear weapons and generate more pressure and actually a movement towards more serious implementation of the disarmament obligations to which nuclear weapon states are bound to by the NPT. Now, next March, as you said, the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW will take place, and I've been given the great honor and responsibility to preside over this meeting and to facilitate the preparations for it. And these preparations have been going extremely well so far, despite the COVID enforced limitations. States parties and signatories of the TPNW have been very clear that they take this conference seriously, and they want to use this opportunity to put the implementation on a strong and solid track. And of course, one important aspect of the TPNW and the focus of the first meeting of states parties are the positive obligations in the treaty on victim assistance and on addressing the environmental remediation of nuclear weapons. And here the Hibakusha and victims from communities affected by nuclear weapons testing have played such an important role in making this a very strong element of the TPNW. We all hope, the TPNW community hopes, that we'll send a very strong political message at the first meeting of states parties, refocusing on the humanitarian consequences and risks of these weapons. It will be an important opportunity to underscore, opportunity for states and for civil society to underscore the importance of the humanitarian rationale of the TPNW, and every participating state and civil society organization is important to demonstrate the growing support for the treaty and for moving away from the dangerous and misguided reliance on nuclear weapons. And all states have been invited by the Secretary General, and we will of course welcome the participation of everybody, because we of course want and we need the engagement of those who are still skeptical about the TPNW and who are still stuck in the belief on nuclear deterrence. So while states are perfectly entitled to not support, not ratify the TPNW at this stage, there's no reason and there's no excuse not to engage with the profound humanitarian arguments on which the TPNW rests. And I certainly hope that many states that do not yet support the treaty will be participating at the first meeting of states parties as observers. And let me close, because I think my time is up, with a reference to the COVID pandemic, which I think has shown how vulnerable and how fragile our societies are, and how our collective security is in reality inextricably linked. And while the coronavirus will not wipe out humanity, despite the very serious problems that we all face, with nuclear weapons, this risk is very clear and present, and they certainly have the potential. So the experts of the doomsday clock has warned and have explicitly said, and I think this is a really important reminder, that today's pandemic must be a wake-up call to solve the nuclear weapons conundrum once and for all. And I think the TPNW really points the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Yeah, I do remember vividly how in 2010 at the NPT Review Conference we had problems putting in like a single sentence in the final document on the humanitarian aspects of the use of nuclear weapons. So it was an uphill battle. So I'm very glad, and we in the UN, we are very glad that we have this treaty coming about. What I forgot to say about Ambassador Kmentt is that he took a sabbatical, if I remember correctly, 2019, worked as a fellow at King's College, and he didn't waste his time because he wrote a book about the TPNW, how it was achieved, how it matters. And I strongly recommend anybody to get hold of a copy of that book and read it carefully.
Thanks for the promotion.
Hey, you're welcome. What I also forgot to say is that we will have a Q&A session, but only after all the speakers have spoken. But I invite participants already to prepare questions. I myself would have a lot of questions to Alexander, but I'll refrain from raising them in public as long as I'm a UN employee, which is not going to last very long anymore. So, okay. With that, we have our next speaker, Beatrice Fihn, who is the Executive Director of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She won with her campaign the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. She also delivered the Nobel lecture in Oslo on behalf of the campaign. And she has led the campaign long after we met Beatrice, since 2013. And she has continued to work, mobilize civil society. Beatrice has quite an intense and very profound, deep-going experience on international disarmament diplomacy, civil society mobilization. So with that, Beatrice, if you don't mind, I pass you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Valere. And hi, everyone. It's really, really nice to be here. I hope you're all doing well in Vienna. The other three of you, I think you're in Vienna. Yeah, it's really great to be here. And I'm really glad that we're talking about the stories from Hiroshima and Nagasaki today, because I think that it's so important that we make sure that this is not just historical events we talk about in an abstract way, but that it's really needed knowledge for what we need to deal with now, today in the world. As Alex said, and I think it's really important to kind of emphasize over and over again, experts and scientists agree the risks of using nuclear weapons use is increasing. And for those of us who watched for decades, the scientists and experts warn about climate change. Here in Geneva, I've heard numerous panels from WHO talking about pandemics. There's going to be a pandemic. There will be pandemics. We have to be ready for this. We really don't have the luxury of ignoring this threat of nuclear weapons. And we're seeing how different types of threats like climate change, like pandemics, like other issues, just very rapidly are changing the way we see security threats and how to protect people. It's to now protecting us long-term against the threats. And what actually protected us during the pandemic, that was nurses and delivery people and grocery store workers and cleaners, much more than weapons themselves. So I think that this kind of new world we're living in, and this is going to continue over the next coming years with technological development, really requires a new type of thinking on how to protect people. And we're seeing very worrying development with all nuclear armed states modernizing their nuclear arsenals. We've seen very concerning reports about buildups of nuclear missile silos in China. We've seen an announcement of a 40% increase of nuclear warheads in the United Kingdom. But really all 9 nuclear armed states are modernizing their nuclear weapons. So I think that's really why basing our discussions on the impact of nuclear weapons and the stories from Hiroshima and Nagasaki are so important, so that it doesn't become abstract and sort of a theoretical conversation about nuclear weapons, but it's really reality. So my big thanks to ODA for organizing this discussion. Since Alex has already discussed sort of the TPNW and the treaty itself, I want to focus a little bit more about maybe a perspective on civil society, on how we see the treaty moving forward and what we're working on to change thanks to this treaty. So as the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons entered into force this year, it's a really big deal. And of course, for a lot of people, international law is very abstract, but it's enormously important that for the first time ever, nuclear weapons are banned under international law. And they will together with other weapons, such as chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, as this category of weapons that are banned under international law. And that will start having a significant impact over time. International law is, unfortunately, not something that just you flip a switch and suddenly everything changes. It is something that progressively will change over time. And of course, I think it's important to be aware that the treaty itself is a piece of paper, and it will only start having that kind of impact if people and governments and organizations actually support the treaty and use the treaty. And I think it's really important to highlight that these things don't happen automatically. We, people, individuals, and institutions need to make it happen. So for ICAN, our priorities are pretty clear now that the treaty has entered into force. In order for us to achieve nuclear disarmament, we need to use this treaty as a tool to create a norm against nuclear weapons that's abided by everyone and that leads to concrete disarmament work. And we're working sort of on 3 or 4 different areas in order to achieve that. I think the first thing is, of course, one of the most fundamental things for this treaty is that all the states parties of the TPNW need to fully implement the treaty. And I think that's why it's really exciting to start working on the first meeting of states parties, to really set up the treaty structure, to make sure that all the countries that so far joined this treaty are really doing what they have committed to do under international law. We're working on projects on victim assistance and environmental remediation, concrete initiatives that really has the potential to be to lead to concrete results for real people that have been impacted by this weapon. We're hoping that promote the treaty, talk about defense, of course, work to universal. I think this is a huge focus in the coming years, that the states that have joined the treaty and have made this treaty enter into force now, fulfill their obligations on this treaty. The second thing, of course, that's really important for us to move forward now is to get more states parties. The more states parties that are on board, the stronger this norm is going to be. And there's a lot of work going on this, both from government side, international organization side, and of course, civil society.
Beatrice, can I ask you to cut your video? It's not that we don't want to see you, but you're cutting in and out.
Sorry. I have a shady Wi-Fi here in the office.
All right.
Is that better?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Just flag if I start cutting out again, and then maybe Martin could take over for a little bit. It should come back. It comes and goes, my Wi-Fi. We parties, and the more states, or the treaty is going to be stronger. And that includes both bringing on more countries in Africa and Pacific, Latin America, Asia, but also European countries, of course, and the countries that rely on nuclear weapons. This is really when we work a lot in parliaments, trying to build support in domestic processes. We work with cities, local governments, regional governments in that way, and really trying to push as many governments as possible to join. And we're really excited to constantly see progress on those things, and hoping that there will be soon a few more ratifications and that the membership will continue to build over the years. And the other thing that is really essential to use with this treaty and how this treaty is going to work in the future is that now we have the law, and now we have to change behavior based on the law. And this is something that we want to do with the countries that have joined it, but also countries that have not yet joined it. We are working to stop all the activities that are now banned by this treaty. Just for example, as people and governments came together to really condemn and protest, for example, North Korea's nuclear test, we need to do similar things now with developments of nuclear weapons, testing, production, maintenance, hosting nuclear weapons, as well as threatening to use them. And this is something that really, of course, both states parties of the TPNW needs to be involved, but also this is something that anyone in any country around the world, in any group of people can work on. A couple of examples of that is, for example, from ICAN side, we're putting a lot of emphasis on divestment work right now. As a result of the treaty entering into force, we're asking banks, pension funds, and other financial institutions to sell off assets in nuclear weapons producing companies because of the TPNW. And it's something that we've seen be really effective in other weapons treaties. For example, in cluster munitions and landmines, really funding for those weapons really dried up and impacted private companies that were making these weapons. And these companies know the markets, and they know if a weapon has a future or not. And what we saw, for example, for cluster munitions is that companies, and these are weapons companies, they are not particularly interested in the humanitarian side of things, but they stopped making cluster munitions because it was not a good investment for the future. It was going out of use, and therefore they pulled out of it. So I think that that's a really important part of this work. We're working with, for example, scientists, faculty, students at several American universities. We've done research and found that around 50 American universities are involved in building and maintaining nuclear weapons. And we're trying to really kind of promote that as an action people can take to stop their universities from being involved. This is not something that should be normal, that UCL or MIT are building weapons of mass destruction that could mass murder civilians. This needs to be controversial and something that students and faculty need to oppose to. Using kind of the TPNW to oppose the massive spending on nuclear weapons. We've seen that during the pandemic, they've spent over, $73 billion last year on these weapons of mass destruction. And the treaty gives us a great platform to argue why these budgets must be cut, because this weapon is banned. Oh, we should to survive the pandemic. So there's a lot of these kind of things that we can do, but also educational work for the public, for politicians, making this a priority for governments, using the treaty, and also in other kind of creative ways like arts and culture to change the perception that these weapons, like some people believe that they're necessary evil, to something that is completely unacceptable and now illegal in people's minds, because that would also have a huge influence on norm building in this world. So there's a lot of really concrete ways that we can use this treaty now, and each of these will sort of strengthen the international law, strengthen the treaty, and facilitate for nuclear disarmament to happen in the future. So thank you.
I have to find a button that tells me what all the buttons are for. Thank you very much, Beatrice. It was very, very interesting. We are moving now to the third presenter from the academic world. It's Dr. Martin Sen, not unknown to the disarmament community. Martin is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Innsbruck. He is also a guest lecturer at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna. Martin deals in his research with security studies, international order, ideas, ideational change, political communication, and the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, I understand for this session he has prepared something special, so I would like to give him the floor. Thank you, Martin.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I can live up to the expectation that I've brought something special, so I'll do my best. What I have brought with me is like a good academic, a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know whether that's something special. I fear not. I hope that I can make it work. How can I share it? I don't know. Can you see it? No.
No, you have the little button next to the leave button with the arrow pointing up. That's where it should go.
Okay, just let me. Ah, yeah, there it is. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, that's fine, Martin. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very topical and important webinar. As you heard already, it's my task to give you kind of an academic perspective on this topic of nuclear disarmament. Now, what I want to do in my remarks is I want to give you a broader perspective on this topic, meaning that I want to zoom out and I want to look at the global nuclear order, that is the global political order that was created to control the use of nuclear energy. And I want to give you a couple of arguments on what this or on how this order is structured, how it has developed in recent years, and then also my informed guess on where it will go in the future. So my remarks are structured around 4 arguments. The first argument is a theoretical one on the nature of order in world politics. So don't be worried, I won't give you a theoretical lecture about international order, but it's just a couple of remarks on what order is in world politics and how we can imagine order. The second argument builds on this theoretical sketch, and it's then on the nature of this so-called nuclear order and the nature of this order in the first 7 decades of its existence. The third argument is then on the current state of this nuclear order, and the fourth and final argument is then a normative one. It's a normative argument on how to shape the order in the near and mid-future. Now, argument number 1 is that political orders are at their core ideological projects. They are political spaces in which ideologies compete for dominance. So this is my theory, if you will, of international orders. They are ideological projects, they are political spaces in which ideologies compete for dominance. Now, competing for dominance means that the ideologies, or rather the actors, the different actors that carry the ideologies, seek to make their ideology appear as natural, as taken for granted, as without alternatives. Now, ideology is an analytical term. Most of you will probably have negative feelings about the term ideology, but for me, it's first of all an analytical term that says, okay, an ideology is a system of ideas about how the political world is and how it ought to be. So it's a system of ideas that actors carry in their head. Now, in this system of ideas, not all ideas are equal. There are some ideas that are more fundamental and some that are more peripheral. that build on those fundamental ones. And today I want to focus on those really fundamental ideas that are the fundamental fabric of international orders. They are the core ideas of an ideology. And in those ideologies that constitute international orders, that make up international orders, we can identify three types of core ideas or fundamental ideas. Ideas about legitimate objects, about legitimate subjects, and about legitimate knowledge in international orders. Now, what does this mean? Legitimate object means that these ideas characterize what is at stake in a political order. Can be anything from the state to human beings, the biosphere, mankind, the globe, whatever. This is the object of an order. What is at stake? The second type of core ideas or fundamental ideas refers to the subjects of an order. So basically, who is entitled to engage in ordering? Who is entitled to act, to shape an order? Those are the subjects of an order. The third type of core ideas are ideas about legitimate forms of knowledge. So what types or ways of knowing are accepted as valid in a political order? So those are the three kinds of fundamental ideas that we see in those ideologies that eventually make up order in world politics. And it's also through these fundamental ideas that ideologies establish hierarchies and that they establish patterns of exclusion within political orders. So now that's the theoretical sketch. Political order for me is about ideology. Ideology is about core ideas and peripheral ideas. The core ideas are about objects, subjects, and knowledge of ordering. Argument number two, now building on that. I argue that the global nuclear order has been dominated by an ideology that I call nuclear oligarchism. And this ideology has established multiple patterns of exclusion and hierarchy. Now, let's look at those core ideas that are within this ideology of nuclear oligarchism. Oligarchy meaning the rule of the few. Small group of actors is ruling, is like the chief of this order, if you will. Now, if we look at those core ideas, we can see that in terms of the legitimate object, so what is this order is about, this ideology of nuclear oligarchism is very much state-focused. It's about state security in view of the tremendous destructive power of nuclear energy. The subjects, the legitimate subjects in this ideology are states, primarily states, to a lesser extent also international organizations. They are the holders of rights and responsibilities in this order. And this ideology has also an inbuilt hierarchy which says that only a small group of states are the true architects and shapers of this order. This is essentially this group of official nuclear weapon states. So when we look at this layer of the subject, this ideology is exclusive and it's very hierarchical. What's also interesting and what gets a lot less attention also in the academic debate is are those core ideas about knowledge. So what ways of knowing are accepted in an ideology? And here we can also see that nuclear oligarchism is characterized by an exclusive view of knowledge. It's really essentially the knowledge of scientists and practitioners, of diplomats, statesmen, and military that is accepted as the proper, the legitimate way of generating knowledge about nuclear weapons. Other ways or other means of creating knowledge are sidelined, in particular knowledge that has been created by victims of the production and use of nuclear weapons. So this has been a knowledge type that has not had legitimacy in this ideology. Now, building on this set of fundamental ideas, this ideology has branched out into different communities, and those communities have been at times very much at odds with each other. So there has been an intensive debate about various communities, for example, between deterrence and arms control communities, between deterrence and disarmament communities. So, for example, you may all remember this article by George Shultz, or this series of articles by George Shultz, William Perry, Kissinger, and Nunn, who were also very much part of this ideological field, if you will. So there was a lot of debate, but the important point is the fundamental assumptions were always the same. So the interesting thing is that although there was a lot of branching out, a lot of debate, this debate has actually solidified those fundamental assumptions that created patterns of exclusion and hierarchy. So in short, these intra-ideological disputes have reinforced those fundamental assumptions of the ideology. We have seen a lot of debate in this nuclear weapons field, but most of the time this debate has just reinforced those fundamental ideas that are constituting this ideology. Now let's move on to argument number 3. And this argument is that a new ideology, which I label anti-nuclear anarchism, has successfully challenged the dominant ideology of nuclear oligarchism. Like ideology, this term of anarchism has unfortunately very negative connotations. So probably most of you, when you hear the word anarchy or anarchism, you think of lawlessness, you think of disorder, you think of bomb-throwing terrorists. But this is not what anarchy and anarchism means in an original and analytical sense. Anarchy, from the Greek anarchos, means without ruler. So anarchy means that political order is not imposed top-down, but that it can evolve from the bottom up. So it basically means that there is a political order without domination, without subordination. This is what anarchy means. So what we see in the nuclear order right now, that there is a second ideology, a strong ideology that I label anti-nuclear anarchism. It's against nuclear weapons, and it's also against order that is hierarchical. It's a bottom-up way of creating order. Now, this anti-nuclear anarchism has also evolved around a set of core ideas. The first one and fundamental one is that the object of ordering is the human being. So, as Alexandra and Beatrice mentioned before, it's no longer about state security, but it's about human security. That's the central focal point of this new ideology. Also, in terms of the subjects, it has been more inclusive. It's an anarchical ideology. It's inclusive. It's bottom-up. You could see this in those different conferences that also the Humanitarian Initiative held, Nayarit, Vienna, Oslo, where it was really about bringing state and non-state actors together without hierarchy. So it's an inclusive ideology. And the third ideological core point, if you will, is that it's also inclusive in terms of the knowledge that it accepts. So it's not only about experts, practitioners, but it's also about giving victims a voice and accepting that they have a special and a very important way of knowing what nuclear weapons can do. This ideology has emerged as a powerful competitor to nuclear oligarchism, and as you know, it has laid the foundation for the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, the fourth and final argument with which I will close is that nuclear order is now characterized by ideological bipolarity. So we see two ideologies that are basically structuring this order. And from my view, or in my view, what is important now is that to prevent disruptive and destructive effects of ideological competition, it is necessary to think about mechanisms for managing this bipolarity. As a start, for example, I would suggest that both sides should accept that they represent political ideologies, that they accept that they both are guided by visions about how the nuclear order should be structured. So it's not that one side represents the true, the real, and the other side the vision, the normative utopianism, but both sides actually represent a political ideology, a political view about how the world should be. And I think accepting this would be a first step towards managing this bipolarity. A second aspect that should be important in the near and longer future, maybe, is that we should think about possibilities of ideological neutrality or bridge building. And I know this is something that has been very much on Alexander's agenda recently. So, for example, are there state or non-state actors that are ideologically neutral? Can this be possible? And if so, could they help overcome those ideological differences? And also, would it be possible to build bridges between those camps in terms of a ideological middle ground? Would that be possible? So my concluding statement is that I see a lot of also disruptive potential in this ideological bipolarity, and we would be well advised to really make sure that this bipolarity is well managed. Now, I want to close with a personal statement. Now that you've heard my ideas about international order and the state of the nuclear order, the personal statement is that I really think that it's important, and it's ever more important, to really raise awareness about what nuclear weapons can do, what they have done and what they can do. And I think it's also in particular important that we do so at universities, because this is an ideal place to shape the perceptions of new generations. And I think here we have to be very aware that the way we speak about nuclear weapons makes a huge difference. So, for example, it's very tempting to speak about nuclear weapons in terms of megatons, throw weights, and things like that. So this sanitized language of nuclear deterrence. But I think in particular in university education, we have to also go along with this paradigm shift that was presented before, and really make our students aware of what those weapons actually do to human beings. This has to be very, very much part of our academic curriculum. And I will do my best to educate my students in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. I have a question myself, Alexander, if you don't mind. We have been working together also on the APLC, and I see some similarity there in when it comes to victim assistance and environmental rehabilitation. That is something that is, as I said, it's in the APLC. It's not new, but in the field of nuclear disarmament, it is quite new. How do you think that people are going to deal with it? Because if we look at the COVID crisis at this moment, countries have a hard time coping with a virus. How are they going to cope with a nuclear detonation? God forbids it ever happens again.
Thank you. I see that the screen is still shared, at least on my computer. Maybe you want with a sort of funny. Yes, now it's gone. I think certainly the victim assistance and environmental remediation aspects of the TPNW have been informed by the Mine Ban Treaty, by the Cluster Munitions Convention, by the humanitarian disarmament approach, by the human security approach, by the democratization. Martin called it anarchy. I always call it democratization of the debate, where states, but maybe even more importantly, non-state actors, civil society, started to look at weapons not merely from a military utility perspective, but to look at it in terms of what do these weapons do, and ask the question about the legitimacy of the by weighing the military utility against the impact. And of course, logically, there is no weapon where this question is more pertinent than with nuclear weapons. I think of course, there's also no weapon system where the question is more complicated, because the military utility is so strongly argued, or the security value is so strongly argued on the one side, whereas of course the impact is so particularly devastating on the other side. So it very clearly comes from the tradition that has been established over the last 20, 30 years. One of the central conclusions of the humanitarian initiative, because you ask, we're dealing with the health impact of a pandemic, how would we deal with nuclear weapons explosion? We wouldn't. One of the key conclusions is that every humanitarian actor you ask, there are no capacities to deal with the medical and other humanitarian emergencies, nor is it realistic to think that they could be established. So it's easy to say that, but if you really think about it, what is the conclusion of that? The only conclusion, the only meaningful conclusion must be prevention. So you can take some measures, you can give people iodine, you can address some aspects, but in reality, you cannot. And that's a particularly important element with the nuclear weapons debate, and what is the political conclusion that follows from it. So I think the expertise, the testimony, the knowledge, as Martin pointed, that was brought into the debate from people who've actually experienced that in Japan and in the nuclear weapons testing campaigns over the decades, is so extremely important, because it actually makes the very clearly most convincing point for the necessity for prevention, because of the unspeakable suffering that these people and communities have suffered. So it's a crucially important aspect of the treaty. Implementation of it will be important, but the fact that it is in the treaty, and the fact that a voice has been given to the people and communities who've experienced that, it actually makes the political case for prevention so tangible. I think that's why it's such an important element of the TPNW.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I agree, Alexander. Thank you so much. I have another question here, and that is, how can NATO allies of nuclear weapon states be incentivized to join the TPNW? I have read somewhere that it wouldn't be a problem if NATO allies such as Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, you know, the ones I'm talking about, could join the TPNW while NATO itself would remain nuclear. Is that realistic? And I think that's something for Beatrice to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the incentive for joining the treaty is to avoid nuclear war. And I think that needs to be centered, like the conversation around the risk of nuclear weapons use and what would happen when nuclear weapons are actually used, is that conversation is something we have to have much more. And like Alex also rightly pointed out, that nuclear armed state and also countries that rely on these threats to use weapons of mass destruction as a part of their security doctrine really very rarely acknowledges that conversation and tries to distract away from that and does not want to even think about it. I mean, I even had when you get into these kind of discussion and debates, I had a conversation with a former high up official of NATO. When I pushed this person further on the question of, it will eventually happen by mistake or by accident, he said, well, I don't think that will happen. And to me, like the potential end of humanity, like cannot rely on some people say they don't think it will happen without any kind of arguments or evidence or science backing that up. And we know that the risk is increasing. And not only that experts and scientists says that the risk is higher than it's ever been right now, but the kind of technological development, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, the speed of warfare, just uncertainties in terms of warfare is going to speed that up and make it even more unpredictable in the future. So I really think that we need to put it much more to these countries that having nuclear weapons is a liability and it's an enormous risk, and they have to answer how they're going to protect their people against that. we are in this narrative still where people who support weapons of mass destruction kind of say it's for deterrence, for protection, and that's the end of the story. But we must have a much more kind of deeper conversation about the risks that are involved with that. And also for them to really listen at the security concerns of others. I am Swedish, living in Switzerland. I don't want anything to do with nuclear weapons, yet me and my family is at risk because of the United States and China and Russia and North Korea, the UK, France. I mean, we all will die, right? And what agency do I have to make decisions over my future and my family's future and my community's future? So I think there has to be a much more, deeper conversations about the risks and the impacts of nuclear weapons. And I think the humanitarian conferences really made a great effort to that. And we've seen how the pressure on these countries have increased thanks to those conversations. So I think we just have to continue. And I think the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a great kind of tool to really push these policymakers to not do what they've done with climate change, right? And just ignore it until it's almost too late. We are still able to do things on climate change, but once nuclear weapons are used, it's going to be too late. So once we actually feel it, there's no going back from that. So we really have to act now.
Alexander, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on what Beatrice has said. I think part of the paradigm shift that I referred to is that the TPNW makes the realist case for nuclear disarmament. I think the nuclear disarmament debate over the decades has often been successfully portrayed, and I think Martin referred to also the way we speak about these weapons and the concepts. It has been framed as, yes, it would be nice, but it's this utopian idea, and people who promote nuclear disarmament don't really understand security. And we are the realists, and we understand security, and nuclear deterrence is important. And I think the more you look at the empirical facts of the consequences of nuclear weapons and the damage and the impact and the lack of response capability, and the more you look at what you can measure in terms of risks, the more you actually create a body of evidence that counters that. So Bea said she had this conversation with a high NATO official who said he doesn't think it will happen. That is a belief. So you have to weigh the belief that nuclear deterrence will remain stable and nothing will happen, which you cannot prove. You have to weigh this against what you can prove. You also don't know whether these consequences are going to happen. But given that the consequences are so grave, what is the balance of the argument? So I think the humanitarian focus makes an extremely powerful realist case that on balance, let's get out of the system because it's too risky and too dangerous. And as I said, and Bea referred to that, there has been very little engagement on this balance of arguments because the answers are probably not there on the side of those who argue in favor of nuclear weapons. Thank you. Sorry for this long.
No, we're very interested in what you're saying, Alexander. Martin, I was going to come to you without you raising your hand, but please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add a point to what Alexander just said. I think one of the reasons why deterrence theory has been so successful is that it's, like you said, presented itself as something that is true, something that is that really adequately depicts what the world is like, the world of dealing with nuclear weapons. And also it was successful because it really got rid of many of the unpleasant things about nuclear weapons. Like I mentioned before, this sanitizing of language. When you talk about like a throw weight or megatons or things like that, well, okay, nice numbers. But I think that's the two pillars that tell you why deterrence theory has been so successful and so enduring. Because it said, we are representing reality, and it cut off large parts of the reality of nuclear weapons.
Very true, Martin. Let's get a couple more questions here. I got a very interesting one here. I don't know how to tackle that one. There has been a group of US lawmakers recently that has urged the US president to ensure that the Taliban do not destabilize Pakistan and acquire nuclear weapons. It's not really linked to the discussion here at hand, but it's still an interesting question. Question is, how realistic is that threat? How realistic is the fact or the possibility that the Taliban would get into Pakistan, put their hands on nuclear weapons? Does anybody have any idea on that?
Well, no, I don't, because nobody can assess the risk, but it is a risk. And the issue with nuclear weapons, you have to look at the aggregate risk that the global practice around nuclear weapons brings to all humanity. I cannot quantify that particular risk, but it's one risk. And there are many other risks. And as Bea said, eventually, one of those risks is going to materialize unless we manage to address this in a preventative way. So that particular issue, the security of the Pakistani nuclear weapons program, has been discussed for a very long time, but I cannot quantify it. But it is a risk, and we have to address these risks in a much, much more from a sort of global citizen aggregate perspective. Thank you.
True. Beatrice, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult sort of thing to predict, of course, but we do know that things will constantly change in all these countries, and we will have crises, and we will continue to have conflict. We will have irrational leaders. We will have governments who do not actually represent, are not actually acting in the best interest of its people. And that will continue. And unfortunately, keeping nuclear weapons we're not going to get a perfect world where leaders are like flawless, ever. So, but the question is, are we going to let them have the tools to basically end humanity as we know it and be able to wipe out such massive amounts of civilian populations and long term and in countries where far away from where the actual warfare is going on? I mean, I think the nuclear weapons are so unique in terms of its devastating impact, both in terms of how long the impact remains. So we've seen that the hospitals in Hiroshima and Nagasaki still are treating for the consequences of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also how it spreads across borders and how it's impossible to contain it, both in time and in space. So I think that really just makes, these kind of situations where you have vulnerable governments, you might have kind of riots, revolutions, you have dictators, you have all these different kind of contexts that will continue to some extent. I mean, ideally not, but I mean, in reality, I think that we will see that in many countries, but we just must, or any leaders really, have weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. Yes. It's difficult to judge. I personally have a problem with the question, but who am I? But I have another question that is much closer to what we are doing here. Is the question from Mr. Teshome to Ambassador Kmentt. The nexus between the TPNW and Pillar 3 of the NPT. Pillar 3 is peaceful uses, and I don't know what maybe Mr. Teshome, you could clarify your question, because I'm trying to get my head around what you want to say about this. So if I can give you the floor, Mr. Teshome.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're online.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, my question was, as we all know, I mean, Ambassador Kmentt has mentioned the relationship between the two other pillars, the disarmament and non-proliferation, and how the TPNW is considered as a complementary mechanism or a strengthening the already existing nuclear governance instead of weakening the system. So I was trying to make sense of how the nuclear taboo, the taboo against the use and the possession of nuclear weapons can directly or indirectly affect the quest for expanded access to peaceful uses of nuclear weapons, because what comes to people's mind usually is the radiations, the disasters, the accidents, and the consequences of nuclear generally, without making a distinction between weapons and the peaceful uses. So this was what I had in mind. So what is the relationship between the TPNW and then the pillar 3? Is there any contradiction? Is there any complementarity? Sorry for making it longer, but that was what I was trying to ask. Thank you very much.
I would have a hard time answering that, Alexander, but I'll give you a shot.
Just briefly, I don't really think there is a nexus. I mean, the NPT includes Pillar 3 as a sweetener, for lack of better word, for non-nuclear weapon states to have renounced any plans or the option to develop nuclear weapons. So Pillar 3 is part of a sort of a deal. The TPNW doesn't need that. The TPNW very clearly looks at the weapon only, and it contains a very clear, unequivocal prohibition of nuclear weapons because of the humanitarian consequences. It doesn't need any sort of exchange to deal with that. So Pillar 3 is a particular aspect of what was called the grand bargain of the NPT, but it's not it's not relevant for the TPNW. So the TPNW link to the NPT is on the first two pillars, is on nuclear disarmament, of course, and on non-proliferation, but not for the sort of right of access to peaceful uses for nuclear energy.
Yes.
If I may add to this, just a couple of sentences. There may be an indirect link because there are certain regions in the world that have shown an increasing interest in the use of nuclear energy. The Middle East, African countries, Asian countries, for example, some of them. So, and as Alexander mentioned before, the TPNW is also like reinforcing the non-proliferation safety net that we have. So in this respect, if there are some countries that are getting more interested in acquiring nuclear weapons, and there is an additional barrier to acquiring them, to the acquisition of nuclear weapons, then there is also an indirect connection, if you will.
Very well, thank you so much. I don't have more questions directly related to our discussion, but if participants would have more questions, please do not hesitate to send them to us, the organizers, and we'll pass them on to the panelists and try to figure out a way to post them somewhere that they're accessible for everybody.
I see a question to Beatrice in the chat.
Yes, I see one too now. What are we looking at? Okay. Is that the one you mentioned, Alexander? What can citizens do to advance nuclear disarmament in their countries and to promote universalization of TPNW? Maybe Beatrice, you're best placed to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely a lot of things to do. The number one thing is, of course, to share information and talking about the treaty, about the risks of nuclear weapons. I think that's extremely important that we make the issue visible. Most people around the world want nuclear disarmament. In poll after poll, we see a majority of people actually don't like nuclear weapons and don't want them around. But there's an incredible lack of confidence in people that we can change it. There's like this narrative around nuclear weapons that we oh, we're kind of stuck with them. They exist, so now we have to keep them forever. Which is obviously not is a really good example of kind of inspiring people that it is possible to change things, it's possible to do things. So sharing information about it is really useful. Sharing it with politicians, with journalists, with opinion leaders, and things like that, I think is extremely important. We have things like tools called the ICAN Parliamentary Pledge, which is something that parliamentarians in your country can sign and be a part of a growing network of elected officials around the world that are working to get their governments to join the treaty. And through that, they will be connected with other politicians in their country and can sort of work to put forward motions in parliaments and to put pressure on their governments. We have another thing called the ICAN Cities Appeal, is to really use cities as sort of vehicles for educating people and creating that kind of political pressure. And a lot of cities around the world are taking local decisions in their city councils to support the treaty and urge their government to join it, such as Paris, Washington, Los Angeles, Sydney, Berlin. You know, cities all over the world have adopted these motions and support the treaty, because cities are the targets of these weapons. These weapons are meant to wipe out whole cities. That's what they're built to do. So cities have a responsibility to act. You can also talk to your bank, your pension fund, and ask them if they invest in illegal weapons and share the information that nuclear weapons are now illegal. So there needs to be a new policy and selling off assets in nuclear weapons producing companies. We have a website called Don't Bank on the Bomb that is a place we can find which banks are good, which banks are bad, which companies should be divested from, and things like that. So there's quite a lot of things, but I think in particularly we have to look at our own networks and the people that we already are talking to and working with, and see if they can start supporting this treaty, if they can talk about the treaty, if they can call on their governments and politicians to support the treaty, and start from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Beatrice. In addition to that, I would like to come back to something very interesting that Martin said, is the change of the wording, change of the phraseology around nuclear weapons. When I was younger, I had the pleasure or the misfortune, you can call it what you want, to represent Belgium on nuclear issues in NATO. And I was appalled by the use of tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons, because there is nothing tactical about the nuclear weapon. Especially if you look at the weapons deployed in Europe, they are, I cannot give you an exact number, but close to 200 kilotons is feasible, while the weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 10 to 20 kilotons. So if you see the consequences in Japan, and then we talk about 200 kilotons for a tactical nuclear weapon in Europe, it's really, I was gobsmacked. But that's the way it is. Meanwhile, it hasn't changed much. It's now they call it sub-strategic and strategic weapons. So I fully agree with Martin to look at the wording of those things and don't hide the truth anymore. Martin.
Well, thank you. Just one thing that also came to my mind. I think we also have to think about the salience of the issue, because if you ask people, okay, would you be in favor of abolishing nuclear weapons? I think most of them would say yes, of course, because they are horrible weapons. But if you then would ask them, are nuclear weapons really on your mind? I think most of them would say, well, not so much, because they are in a country somewhere, maybe North Korea or wherever. When I give a lecture on nuclear weapons at our university here, I usually ask students, what do you assume, or do you know where the next location of nuclear weapons is? How far away is that? And I usually get answers like, yeah, Russia somewhere, or I don't know, maybe Belgium, Britain. But then I say, no, it's Aviano Air Force Base, and that's not very far away. And so this is one way of really making the issue salient and saying, well, I mean, at the end of the day, if there is a nuclear weapons use, you will all be affected, like Beatrice mentioned before. It's really about the salience and driving home the message. You can't escape it. It's not in a remote place. It will happen in your backyard or in your front yard if you're unlucky. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Martin. I have no more questions, and we're closely approaching the end of our session. So I'd like to put a stop to it, to the discussion.
I suppose I missed some letter. So I would repeat.
Can you mute your mic, please?
Yeah, it's 00 M as in Mike, yeah, the Lanka, HSN Hotel, as in India,
Hello, can you cut your mic, please? All right. So I would like to thank all the panelists for their contributions. It's very useful. It's also nice to see people again. I'd like to make a little publicity for my own shop, as I did for Alexander's book. That is, we do have an online repository of courses on disarmament and non-proliferation and cross-cutting issues. It's on disarmamenteducation.org. And not the next one upcoming, because the next one, the next course that is coming is small arms and light weapons. But the one after that, and it's very much in progress, is a course on the TPNW. So I'd like to invite you to visit our dashboard. We call it dashboard. It's basically online storage of courses, and make use of it. It will also help Martin in his academic world, and not only Martin, but a lot of people. Actually, we did a course in Southeast Asia for educators, which is high school teachers and also university professors on disarmament aspects. It's always nice to work top down, because bottom up is it's uphill, to be honest. Bottom up is uphill. Top down is downhill. Much easier. So having said all that, thank you again. I would like to thank all the participants. Somehow we'll let you know where we're going to post your presentations. Martin, if you could send us your slides, if you give us permission to use them, that would be very nice. So thanks again, Alexander, Beatrice, and Martin, and we'll see each other later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.